The banana was slightly bruised, its peel marked with brown spots that suggested it had been carried carefully for quite some time. Richard Monroe stared at it, then at the small hand offering it to him. A hand encased in yellow rubber gloves, several sizes too large, the kind one might use for washing dishes. The gloves were so oversized that the fingers drooped comically, and the child wearing them had to curl her hands into fists to keep them from slipping off entirely. Richard had been standing outside his office building, about to get into his car after another brutally long day, when the girl had approached him with surprising confidence for someone so young. She couldn't have been more than 5 years old, with dark curls pulled into two slightly crooked ponytails and eyes that seemed far too serious for her age. She wore a dress that had clearly been washed and mended many times, and sneakers that were a size too big, probably hand-me-downs or thrift store finds. But it was the yellow gloves that held his attention, bright and absurd against the grey November evening. "Please, mister," the girl said again, her voice steady despite the trembling of her small body. "My mama needs help. She didn't steal anything, I promise. But they took her away and I don't know what to do." She pushed the banana toward him more insistently. "This is all I have. I picked it from Mrs. Chen's tree and she said I could have it. Will you help my mama? Please?" Richard felt something crack in the carefully constructed walls he'd built around himself over the past 7 years. He was known throughout Atlanta's legal community as the Ice King, the attorney who never showed emotion, who won cases through sheer brilliance and intimidation rather than sympathy or charm. At 38, he'd built one of the most successful corporate law firms in the South, had more money than he could spend in 3 lifetimes, and lived alone in a penthouse that cost more than most people's houses. He had exactly zero tolerance for sentimentality, refused all pro bono cases, and made junior associates cry on a regular basis. The last time he'd felt genuine human compassion had been 7 years ago, before the accident that took everything from him. Before he'd lost his wife Isabella and their unborn daughter in a car crash that shattered his world so completely he'd never quite managed to put the pieces back together. But something about this child with her yellow gloves and her bruised banana and her absolute conviction that her mother was innocent made him pause. Perhaps it was the gloves themselves, so ridiculous and yet worn with such earnest purpose, as if the girl was trying to be grown up and responsible. Perhaps it was the way she looked at him with complete trust, as if she'd decided he was a good person and that was that. No room for doubt. Or perhaps it was simply that he was tired, bone-tired, of being the Ice King, of going home to an empty penthouse, of waking up every morning with the same hollow ache in his chest. "What's your name?" he heard himself ask, his voice gentler than it had been in years. The girl's face lit up with hope, so pure it made his chest hurt. "Sophie," she said quickly. "Sophie Carter. I'm 4 3/4. My mama is Lauren and she works cleaning houses, but they said she stole a necklace, and that's a lie because mama would never steal nothing. She always says stealing is wrong and that we have to work hard for what we get." She took a breath and continued in a rush. "I know you're a lawyer because I asked the lady at the desk and she said you're the best one and that you help people, but you cost lots of money, and I don't have money, but I have this banana, and I thought maybe you could help anyway because mama's all alone at the jail, and I'm staying with Mrs. Chen, but she's old and her house smells funny, and I want my mama to come home." Richard found himself kneeling on the sidewalk, expensive suit be damned, until he was at eye level with Sophie. Up close he could see the tears she was trying so hard not to shed, the way her small hands gripped those yellow gloves like a lifeline. "Sophie, where did you get those gloves?" he asked, not sure why it mattered, but suddenly needing to know. "They're Mama's," Sophie said, looking down at them proudly. "She uses them when she cleans houses. I put them on because they make me feel like I can be strong like her. Mama says when you wear working gloves, you're ready to face anything." She looked back up at him with devastating sincerity. "I needed to be strong to come ask you for help. Mrs. Chen doesn't know I left. I waited until she was taking her nap, and then I walked here because I remembered Mama pointing at this building once and saying that's where the fancy lawyers work who help important people. And I thought if I could just talk to one fancy lawyer, maybe they'd help my Mama even though we're not important." The words hit Richard like a physical blow. Not important. This child thought she and her mother weren't important enough to deserve help, and yet she'd put on her mother's oversized cleaning gloves and walked however many blocks it was from wherever she lived, carrying a banana as payment, because she was willing to try anyway. He thought about his own daughter, the one he'd never gotten to meet, the one who would have been 6 years old now if she'd lived. Would she have been this brave, this determined? Would she have worn silly gloves and offered fruit to strangers if it meant helping someone she loved? "Sophie," Richard said carefully, "I'm going to help your mother. You don't need to give me the banana, but I'll take it anyway because I can see it's important to you. Now I need you to tell me everything you know about what happened. Can you do that?" Sophie nodded vigorously, and then, as if the permission to speak had broken a dam, she began to talk. The story came out in fits and starts, sometimes jumping around in the way children's stories do, but Richard was patient. He'd interviewed enough witnesses to know how to piece together a coherent narrative from scattered details. From what he could gather, Lauren Carter worked as a housekeeper for several wealthy families in Buckhead, Atlanta's most affluent neighborhood. 3 days ago, she'd been cleaning the home of a Mrs. Patricia Ashford when an expensive diamond necklace went missing. Mrs. Ashford had immediately accused Lauren, and despite Lauren's protests of innocence, had called the police. Lauren had been arrested, couldn't afford bail, and was currently sitting in jail waiting for a court-appointed attorney who probably wouldn't have time to properly investigate her case. "Mama was crying when they took her," Sophie said softly, her earlier bravado cracking. "She told me to be brave and that everything would be okay, but I could tell she was scared. Mrs. Chen is nice, but she's not Mama, and I don't like sleeping at her house because it's not home and I keep having bad dreams." She wiped her nose with the back of one yellow-gloved hand. "Do you think you can get my Mama back? Do you think she'll come home soon?" Richard felt something shift in his chest, some long-frozen part of himself beginning to thaw. "I'm going to do everything I can," he promised, and meant it. "But first, I need to take you back to Mrs. Chen's house because she's probably very worried about you. And then I'm going to go see your mother and find out exactly what happened. Okay?" Sophie nodded, and then did something completely unexpected. She threw her small arms around Richard's neck in a fierce hug, the yellow gloves awkward but earnest against his back. "Thank you, Mr. Lawyer," she whispered. "I knew you'd help. I just knew it." Richard carefully hugged her back, this tiny stranger who'd somehow cracked through 7 years of careful emotional armor with nothing but yellow gloves and a bruised banana. As he stood up and offered her his hand, he realized he was smiling for the first time in longer than he could remember. "Call me Richard," he said, "and let's go make sure Mrs. Chen knows you're safe before she calls the police herself." The walk to Mrs. Chen's apartment was only 4 blocks, but it felt like miles as Sophie chattered beside him, her small hand completely swallowed by his larger one, her yellow gloves making soft squeaking sounds as she gesticulated while talking. She told him about her favorite cartoon, about how she was learning to read, about how her mama made the best grilled cheese sandwiches, even though they were kind of burnt sometimes. She told him about her friend Marcus at the community center who could do a handstand, about the stray cat that sometimes came to their fire escape, about how she wanted to be a doctor when she grew up so she could help people feel better. She was so full of life, so absolutely certain that the world was good despite the evidence to the contrary, that Richard found himself both charmed and heartbroken. How had this child maintained such optimism while living in what was clearly poverty, with a mother working multiple cleaning jobs just to keep them afloat? What would happen to Sophie's bright spirit if her mother went to prison for a crime she didn't commit? By the time they reached Mrs. Chen's building, a tired-looking brownstone in a neighborhood that had seen better days, Richard had made a decision that would have shocked anyone who knew him professionally. He was going to take this case. Not for money, not for publicity, not for any of the rational reasons he usually took cases. He was going to take it because a 4 3/4-year-old girl in yellow cleaning gloves had offered him a banana and trusted him to help. And because for the first time in 7 years, he felt like he had a purpose beyond just winning and making money and maintaining his reputation as the Ice King. Mrs. Chen answered the door in a panic, her wrinkled face creased with worry that turned to relief when she saw Sophie. "Oh, thank God," she gasped, pulling Sophie into a hug. "Child, where have you been? I've been calling everyone looking for you." I was about to call the police." She looked up at Richard, her expression shifting from relief to suspicion. "And who are you? Where did you find her?" Richard introduced himself and quickly explained what had happened, leaving out the part about the banana. He watched as Mrs. Chen's suspicion gradually transformed into shocked gratitude. "You mean you're really going to help Lauren?" the old woman asked, her accent thick with what sounded like Cantonese origins. "You're going to take her case for real?" Richard nodded. "I'm going to need some information from you, Mrs. Chen, and I'll need to speak with Lauren as soon as possible. Is there a phone number I can use to reach you?" As Mrs. Chen bustled around looking for a pen and paper to write down her contact information, Sophie tugged on Richard's sleeve. When he looked down, she was holding out the banana again. "You forgot this," she said seriously. "You're supposed to take it. It's payment." Richard felt his throat tighten. "You know what, Sophie? I think you should keep it. You might get hungry later, but I promise I'm still going to help your mama, okay? This isn't about payment. This is about doing what's right." Sophie considered this for a moment, then carefully set the banana on the small table by the door. "Then you should take it anyway," she said with the impeccable logic of a 4-year-old, "because maybe you'll get hungry too. Mama says you should always share food with friends, and I think we're friends now, right?" Richard found himself blinking rapidly, unsure when he'd last been this affected by simple kindness. "Right," he said, his voice rough. "We're friends." He took the banana, slipping it carefully into his jacket pocket. "I'll see you soon, Sophie, and I promise I'm going to bring your mama home." As he left the building and walked back toward his car, Richard pulled out his phone and called his assistant. "Janet, clear my schedule for tomorrow," he said. "All of it. I'm taking a new case, and I need to move fast, and I need you to pull together everything you can find on a woman named Lauren Carter and a Mrs. Patricia Ashford from Buckhead. I want financial records, social media, any prior legal issues, everything. I don't care if you have to work all night. This is priority 1. Janet, who'd worked for Richard for 5 years and had never heard him sound quite like this, was silent for a moment. "Is this a major corporate case?" she asked carefully. "Is someone paying us a lot of money?" Richard looked down at the banana in his pocket, at the slightly crushed yellow peel that a brave little girl had carried for blocks. "No," he said simply, "this is something else entirely. Just trust me on this one, Janet. It's important." That night, Richard sat in his penthouse apartment with case files spread around him, but he couldn't focus on the words. He kept thinking about Sophie's yellow gloves, about her absolute faith that he would help, about her mother sitting in a jail cell for a crime she almost certainly didn't commit. He'd made some calls and learned that Lauren Carter had no criminal record, had been working as a housekeeper for 5 years with excellent references from every previous employer, and was, by all accounts, a devoted single mother who'd never been in trouble with the law. Meanwhile, Mrs. Patricia Ashford had a history of firing employees without cause, had been sued twice by former household staff, and was known in certain circles for her volatile temper and suspicious nature. It should have been an easy case, but the problem was the evidence. The necklace had gone missing during Lauren's shift. There were no other staff members present, and the security footage showed only Lauren entering and leaving the house. The prosecution would argue that she had opportunity and motive, that a single mother struggling financially might be tempted to steal an expensive piece of jewelry. Never mind that Lauren had passed a polygraph test, that there was no evidence of the necklace in her possession or her home, that her bank records showed no sudden influx of money. In the criminal justice system, perception often mattered more than truth, and the perception would be that a poor black housekeeper had stolen from her wealthy white employer. It was a narrative as old as America itself, and Richard knew that without concrete proof of Lauren's innocence, she was facing serious jail time. He stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked downtown Atlanta, the city lights twinkling like stars below him. Somewhere out there, Lauren Carter was spending another night in jail, wondering if she'd ever see her daughter again. And somewhere else, Sophie was probably lying awake in Mrs. Chen's unfamiliar apartment, wearing her yellow gloves like armor against the scary world that had taken her mother away. Richard made a decision. He was going to find that necklace, and he was going to prove Lauren's innocence, and he was going to bring Sophie's mother home. Not because it was profitable or good for his reputation, but because it was the right thing to do. Because a little girl had looked at him with complete trust, and he'd be damned if he let her down. Because for the first time since Isabella and their baby died, he felt like his life might have meaning beyond just existing. He picked up his phone and started making calls. By morning, he'd have the best private investigator in Atlanta on the case. He'd have a motion filed to review all security footage from surrounding properties, and he'd have a strategy to not just defend Lauren Carter, but to find the real story behind that missing necklace. The Ice King was about to show the world that he hadn't forgotten how to fight for something that mattered. And it had all started with a banana and a pair of yellow gloves. The Fulton County Detention Center was exactly as depressing as Richard remembered from his early days as a public defender, back before he'd decided that corporate law paid better and hurt less. The fluorescent lights were harsh and flickering. The walls were that particular shade of institutional beige that somehow managed to be both bland and oppressive. And everything smelled vaguely of disinfectant and desperation. Richard had dressed down for this visit, trading his usual $3,000 suits for simple slacks and a button-down shirt. He'd learned long ago that showing up in obvious wealth to visit an incarcerated client was a good way to make them defensive and mistrustful. He needed Lauren Carter to trust him, to open up about every detail of what had happened, and that wouldn't happen if she felt like he was just another rich person looking down at her from a position of privilege. The guard led him to a small meeting room reserved for attorney-client conferences, and a few minutes later, Lauren Carter was brought in. Richard's first thought was that she looked exhausted, but not defeated, which was a good sign. She was in her late 20s, pretty in an understated way, with dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and eyes that assessed him with the kind of wariness that came from learning not to trust easily. She wore the standard orange jumpsuit but carried herself with a dignity that the institutional clothing couldn't diminish. When she saw him, her expression shifted from wariness to confusion. "I already have a court-appointed attorney," Lauren said as she sat down across from him, her voice steady despite the situation. "I didn't call for anyone else. If the prison sent you, there's been a mistake." Richard leaned forward, resting his forearms on the metal table between them. "Mrs. Carter, my name is Richard Monroe, and I'm here because your daughter hired me." He watched her face carefully as he said it, saw the confusion deepen into something close to alarm. "Sophie is fine," he added quickly. "She's safe with Mrs. Chen, but yesterday evening she walked 4 blocks to my office building, waited until I came outside, and asked me to help you. She tried to pay me with a banana." He pulled the banana from his briefcase, now looking significantly worse for wear after spending the night in his refrigerator, and set it on the table between them. "She was wearing your yellow cleaning gloves, and she was absolutely certain that you were innocent. She said her mama would never steal because stealing is wrong. And for some reason, I believed her." Lauren's composure cracked. Her hands flew to her mouth and tears spilled down her cheeks as the reality of what he was saying hit her. "Oh God," she whispered, "Sophie walked 4 blocks by herself. She could have been hurt, she could have been taken, she could have—" She broke off, shaking her head as if trying to physically dislodge the terrible possibilities. "She's only 4 years old." What was she thinking? "She was thinking that her mother needed help and she was the only one who could get it for you," Richard said gently. "Mrs. Carter, I need you to understand something. I don't normally take cases like this. I run a corporate law firm. I represent Fortune 500 companies in mergers and acquisitions. The last criminal case I worked was 10 years ago. But your daughter looked at me with complete trust and offered me everything she had. And I couldn't say no. I won't say no. So I'm here to tell you that I'm taking your case, and I'm going to do everything in my power to prove your innocence and get you home to Sophie." Lauren wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture that reminded him achingly of Sophie doing the same thing with her yellow-gloved hand. "I can't pay you," she said bluntly. "I have maybe $300 in my bank account, and most of that needs to go to rent. I can't afford a lawyer like you. I know who you are, Mr. Monroe. I've seen your billboards. You're not the kind of attorney who works for people like me." Richard had expected this objection. "You're right, I don't usually work for people in your situation, but I'm making an exception. Consider this pro bono work. My firm does a certain amount of community service each year for tax purposes. Your case will fulfill that requirement. It was a lie. His firm did virtually no pro bono work, but it was the kind of lie that would let Lauren accept his help without feeling like charity. Now, I need you to tell me everything that happened the day the necklace went missing. Every detail, no matter how small or insignificant it seems. Can you do that? Lauren took a shaky breath and nodded. I've been working for Mrs. Ashford for about 6 months, she began, her voice stronger now that she had something concrete to focus on. She's my Tuesday and Friday client, 4 hours each time. I do general housekeeping, some laundry, occasionally meal prep if she asks for it. The pay is good, better than some of my other clients, but she's difficult. Always watching me work, making comments about how I'm doing things wrong, that kind of thing. I just tried to keep my head down and do my job because I couldn't afford to lose the income. She continued, explaining how 3 days ago had been a normal Friday morning. She'd arrived at the Ashford house at 9, let herself in with the key code Mrs. Ashford had given her, and started her usual cleaning routine. Mrs. Ashford had been home but working in her upstairs office, which wasn't unusual. Around 10:30, she came downstairs and started going through her jewelry box, Lauren said. She does that sometimes, trying on different pieces, taking photos for her Instagram. She's really into social media, always posting pictures of her jewelry and clothes and whatever. Anyway, she had this diamond necklace out, really expensive-looking thing. She was wearing it, taking selfies in the hallway mirror while I was cleaning the living room. I remember thinking it was probably worth more than I make in a year. Lauren's voice grew tighter as she continued. Then her phone rang, and she went back upstairs to take the call. When she came back down about 20 minutes later, she was in a panic. She said the necklace was missing from her bedroom, that she'd taken it off to try on a different one, and now it was gone. She immediately accused me, said I must have gone upstairs and stolen it when she was on the phone. Did you go upstairs? Richard asked, though he already suspected the answer. No, Lauren said firmly. I was in the living room and kitchen the whole time. I had no reason to go upstairs. I tried to explain that to her, but she wouldn't listen. She called the police right there, told them her housekeeper had stolen her jewelry. The police came, they searched me and my belongings, they didn't find anything. But Mrs. Ashford was insistent. She said I must have hidden it somewhere to come back for later, or that I had an accomplice who I gave it to. It was like she'd already decided I was guilty and nothing I said mattered. Richard made notes as she talked, his mind already working through the possibilities. Tell me about the security system. I know there are cameras. What do they show? Lauren shook her head in frustration. That's the thing that makes this all so impossible. The cameras show me arriving at 9 and leaving at 1, which is exactly what happened. They show Mrs. Ashford coming and going from different rooms. But there's no camera in the bedroom where she claims the necklace was taken from, and the hallway camera has a blind spot near the bedroom door. So there's no actual footage of anyone taking anything. The prosecution is arguing that the lack of evidence of anyone else being there, combined with the fact that I was the only other person in the house, means it had to be me. But Mr. Monroe, I swear on my daughter's life, I didn't take that necklace. I would never risk everything I have, everything Sophie needs, for some jewelry. It doesn't make sense. Richard believed her. He'd been practicing law long enough to recognize the ring of truth when he heard it. And everything about Lauren Carter's story and demeanor screamed innocence, which meant someone else had taken the necklace, or it hadn't been taken at all. Tell me about Mrs. Ashford's financial situation, he said. Anything you might have noticed. Bills lying around, phone conversations you might have overheard, anything that might give me insight into her life. Lauren thought for a moment. She always seemed to have money, but there were a few times I noticed things. Overdue notices on the counter that she quickly hid when she saw me looking. Phone conversations where she was arguing with someone about credit card bills. Once I heard her on the phone with her husband, something about him cutting off her access to their accounts until she got her spending under control. She was really upset about that, but I don't know if any of that means anything. Rich people have money problems too, I guess. Richard felt something click into place. When was that phone conversation with her husband? The one about her spending? Lauren's eyes widened as she realized where he was going. Maybe 2 weeks before the necklace went missing, she said slowly. Mr. Monroe, you don't think she would stage a theft of her own jewelry, do you? For insurance money? Richard smiled grimly. I think that's exactly what we're going to find out. Mrs. Carter, I need you to trust me and be patient. This kind of investigation takes time. But I promise you, I'm going to get to the truth, and I'm going to get you home to your daughter. In the meantime, I'm going to file a motion to get you out on bail. Your record is spotless, and you have a young dependent child. There's no reason you should be sitting in here while we wait for trial. Lauren's eyes filled with tears again. Thank you, she whispered. I don't know why you're doing this for us, but thank you. Sophie means everything to me. She's all I have in the world. If I went to prison, if I lost her, I don't think I could survive it. Richard felt that crack in his emotional armor widen further. You're not going to lose her, he said with absolute certainty. I'm going to make sure of that. As he left the detention center, Richard felt more energized than he had in years. He had a case to investigate, a theory to prove, and a little girl in yellow gloves depending on him. The Ice King was about to become someone's hero, and he was surprised by how good that felt. His next stop was to visit Sophie, to let her know that he'd seen her mother and that everything was going to be all right. He had a feeling those yellow gloves were going to make another appearance, and strangely, he was looking forward to it. For the first time in 7 years, Richard Monroe felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Richard found himself standing outside Mrs. Chen's apartment building with a bag of takeout from the Korean barbecue place down the street, wondering when he'd become the kind of person who brought dinner to a 4-year-old and her elderly caretaker. The Ice King didn't do house calls. The Ice King didn't buy food for clients' families. The Ice King certainly didn't find himself actually looking forward to seeing a small child in oversized yellow gloves. Yet here he was, carrying bulgogi and kimchi fried rice and extra spring rolls because Sophie had mentioned she liked crunchy things, and he found himself hoping she'd be happy to see him. Mrs. Chen answered the door with surprise written all over her wrinkled face, but it transformed into a warm smile when she saw the takeout bags. Mr. Monroe, you didn't have to do this, she said, ushering him inside the small but immaculately clean apartment. The living room was cramped, filled with mismatched furniture and photos of what he assumed were Mrs. Chen's children and grandchildren, but it had a warmth his penthouse had never possessed, despite all its expensive designer furnishings. Sophie was sitting on the floor watching cartoons, but the moment she saw Richard, she scrambled to her feet and ran to him with such enthusiasm that he nearly dropped the food. She was wearing the yellow gloves again, he noticed, and they were even more comically oversized than he remembered. Mr. Richard, she shouted, throwing her arms around his legs. You came back. Did you see my mama? Is she coming home? Did you give her my banana? Richard carefully set the food on Mrs. Chen's coffee table and knelt down so he was at Sophie's eye level. I saw your mama, he said, watching her face light up with such joy it made his chest ache. She's okay, Sophie. She was worried about you walking all those blocks by yourself, but she's proud of how brave you were. And yes, I gave her the banana. She said to tell you thank you and that she loves you more than all the stars in the sky. That last part was an embellishment, but Richard figured Lauren would have said it if she'd thought of it, and the way Sophie's face absolutely glowed made the small lie worth it. When is she coming home? Sophie asked, her small hands gripping his arms with surprising strength. I miss her so much. It's been 3 whole days, and that's like forever when you're 4 3/4. Richard felt something twist in his chest. 3 days probably did feel like forever to a child. I'm working on getting her home as soon as possible, he said gently. There are some legal things I need to figure out first, some paperwork and investigations, but I promise you, I'm doing everything I can. Your mama didn't do anything wrong, and I'm going to prove it. Do you trust me? Sophie nodded vigorously. I trust you. You have a kind face. Mama says you should always trust people with kind faces unless they're trying to give you candy from a van. But you didn't try to give me candy, so I know you're really kind and not fake kind. Richard couldn't help but smile at the child logic. Your mama is very smart, he said. Now I brought dinner for all of us. Are you hungry? The meal was chaotic in the best possible way. Sophie talked non-stop, telling Richard about her day at the community center where Mrs. Chen had taken her, about the craft project she'd made with popsicle sticks, about how her friend Marcus had gotten in trouble for throwing sand, but she had been very good and followed all the rules. Mrs. Chen interjected occasionally with gentle corrections or additions, and Richard found himself genuinely enjoying the domesticity of it all, the simple pleasure of sharing a meal with people who weren't trying to impress him or get something from him. "Mr. Richard," Sophie said seriously as she picked at her rice with chopsticks she didn't quite know how to use, "why do you help people?" "Mama says lawyers are very important and help people with problems. Is that what you do?" Richard paused, chopsticks halfway to his mouth. It was a simple question, but it struck at something he'd been avoiding thinking about for years. Why did he help people? The truth was, he didn't usually help people like Lauren and Sophie. He helped corporations avoid taxes. He helped wealthy clients protect their assets in divorces. He helped business owners absorb smaller companies and lay off workers. When was the last time he'd actually helped someone who needed it, rather than someone who simply wanted to get richer? "I help people solve their problems," he said finally, which was technically true, even if it wasn't the whole truth. Sometimes the problems are about money or business, and sometimes the problems are about someone being accused of something they didn't do. Right now, I'm helping your mama because she has a problem that needs solving, and I have the skills to solve it. Sophie considered this gravely. "That's good," she announced. "Mama says we should always help people when we can because that's what makes the world better. Even if we don't have much, we can still help. Like how I gave you my banana even though it was my only banana, because helping Mama was more important than keeping the banana for myself." She looked down at her yellow gloves, flexing her small fingers inside them. "And I wore Mama's work gloves because they make me feel strong enough to help. Do you have something that makes you feel strong?" The question hit Richard harder than it should have. Did he have something that made him feel strong? He had his reputation, his wealth, his impressive win record in court. But none of those things made him feel strong, not really. They made him feel successful, powerful even, but not strong in the way Sophie meant. Not strong enough to face his own grief, to move past the loss that had defined him for 7 years, to be vulnerable enough to let people in again. "I'm still looking for my strong thing," he admitted, and was surprised by his own honesty. "But maybe helping people like you and your mama will help me find it." Sophie nodded, as if this made perfect sense. "You can borrow my gloves if you want," she offered generously. "They're really big, so they'll probably fit you. They might help you feel strong like they help me." Richard felt his throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "That's very kind of you, Sophie, but I think the gloves work because they're special to you and your mama. They might not have the same magic for me. Besides, you need them right now. You're being so brave while your mama is away. You need all the strong you can get." After dinner, Sophie insisted on showing Richard her coloring books and the popsicle stick house she'd made at the community center. He sat on Mrs. Chen's worn couch. This man who normally spent his evenings reviewing contracts in a penthouse worth millions, and listened to a 4-year-old explain her artistic vision with complete seriousness. At some point, Sophie climbed into his lap, still wearing those ridiculous yellow gloves, and leaned against his chest as if it was the most natural thing in the world. Richard felt something break open inside him, some locked door he'd been keeping sealed for 7 years. This was what he'd lost when Isabella and their daughter died. Not just his wife and child, but the possibility of moments like this. The simple joy of a child's trust, the weight of a small body relaxed against his. The feeling of being needed, not for his money or his legal brilliance, but just for his presence, his comfort, his willingness to show up. When Sophie's eyes started to droop, Mrs. Chen took her to get ready for bed. Richard heard the sounds of teeth brushing and pajamas being negotiated, the domestic symphony of bedtime routines. When Mrs. Chen brought Sophie back out to say goodnight, the little girl was wearing pajamas with cartoon puppies on them, and still, inexplicably, the yellow gloves. "Will you come back tomorrow?" Sophie asked sleepily as Richard stood to leave. "Will you tell me more about Mama? And can you bring her home soon? I really miss her." Richard knelt down and gently pushed a curl back from Sophie's forehead. "I'll come back soon," he promised. "I can't come every day because I have work to do to help your mama, but I'll visit when I can, and I'll bring her home just as soon as possible. You're being so brave, Sophie. Your mama is lucky to have you." Sophie smiled and then, with the casual affection of a child who'd decided someone was safe, she kissed Richard on the cheek. "Thank you for helping us, Mr. Richard. You're my favorite lawyer." As Richard left the building and walked to his car, he touched his cheek where Sophie had kissed him, marveling at how such a small gesture could affect him so profoundly. He'd been emotionally frozen for 7 years, going through the motions of living without really feeling anything. But somehow, a little girl with yellow gloves and absolute faith in the goodness of people had started to thaw that ice. He couldn't let her down. He wouldn't let her down. Lauren Carter was going to go free, and he was going to prove she was innocent, and Sophie was going to get her mother back. And maybe, just maybe, Richard was going to find his way back to being the kind of person who deserved a child's trust and affection. The next morning, Richard met with the private investigator he'd hired, a sharp-eyed woman named Diana Torres, who had a reputation for finding things people didn't want found. Diana had spent the past 24 hours digging into Patricia Ashford's life, and what she'd uncovered was fascinating. Mrs. Ashford is in serious financial trouble, Diana reported, spreading documents across Richard's desk. Her husband, Marcus Ashford, is a successful investment banker, but he's also smart enough to keep his money separate from hers after she racked up over $200,000 in credit card debt 3 years ago. He pays for the house and basic expenses, but she has an allowance, and that's it. And that allowance has been cut repeatedly because she keeps overspending. Diana pulled up bank statements on her tablet. Look at this. In the past 6 months alone, she's maxed out 4 credit cards, taken out a personal loan she's already defaulting on, and sold several pieces of jewelry to a consignment shop in Buckhead. She's desperate for cash, but doesn't want her husband to know how bad things have gotten, and here's the really interesting part. She turned the tablet to show Richard a series of Instagram posts. Mrs. Ashford loves to show off her jewelry collection on social media. She's got 20,000 followers, mostly other wealthy women interested in fashion and luxury goods. 2 months ago, she posted several photos of that diamond necklace, the one that allegedly got stolen. The post got thousands of likes and dozens of comments asking where she got it, how much it cost, that kind of thing. It was one of her most popular posts. Richard studied the photos, his mind working through the implications. So she establishes the existence and value of the necklace on social media, generating essentially a public record of ownership. Then it conveniently goes missing while her housekeeper, a woman with no criminal record who desperately needs her job, is the only other person in the house. And Mrs. Ashford immediately calls the police and accuses Lauren instead of, say, checking if maybe she just misplaced it or put it somewhere and forgot. Diana nodded approvingly. You're seeing what I'm seeing. This smells like insurance fraud. I checked with my contact at her insurance company. That necklace is insured for $75,000. Mrs. Ashford filed a claim the same day she reported it stolen. If the claim goes through, she gets $75,000 in cash. Her husband never needs to know how badly she needed money. And a poor housekeeper takes the fall for a crime that never happened. Richard felt anger building in his chest, the cold, focused anger that made him dangerous in a courtroom. Do we have any proof the necklace was never actually stolen? Any evidence that she still has it, or that she sold it herself? Diana smiled. I'm working on that. I've got someone checking every pawn shop, jewelry buyer, and consignment store in a 50-mile radius. If she sold it or pawned it before reporting it stolen, we'll find the record. I'm also looking into her social circle, seeing if maybe she gave it to a friend to hold on to for her. These things take time, but I've got good instincts about this. Patricia Ashford staged a theft to commit insurance fraud, and she chose Lauren Carter as her scapegoat because Lauren was convenient, vulnerable, and had no resources to fight back. Except now Lauren has you, and Mrs. Ashford is about to learn that was a very expensive mistake. Richard felt a grim satisfaction. This was what he was good at, piecing together puzzles, finding the weak points in an opponent's story, building a case that couldn't be denied. Keep digging, he told Diana. I need something concrete I can take to the prosecution, enough to get them to drop the charges against Lauren and start looking at Mrs. Ashford instead. And I need it fast. Lauren's daughter is 4 years old and staying with an elderly neighbor. Every day Lauren sits in jail is another day that child goes without her mother. Diana raised an eyebrow. You're really invested in this one, aren't you? I've worked for you for 5 years, and I've never seen you take a case like this. What's different about Lauren Carter? Richard thought about yellow gloves and bruised bananas and a little girl's absolute trust. "Her daughter hired me," he said simply, "and I made a promise to her. I don't break my promises, Diana. Not anymore." That afternoon, Richard filed the motion to get Lauren released on bail. He argued that she had no criminal record, strong ties to the community through her daughter, and no means or motive to flee. The prosecution fought it, arguing that the evidence against Lauren was strong and that she was a flight risk, but Richard had prepared for that. He presented character references from every family Lauren had worked for over the past 5 years, glowing testimonials about her honesty and work ethic. He presented her financial records showing she barely made enough to support herself and Sophie, let alone flee the state. He pointed out that Lauren had voluntarily submitted to a polygraph test and passed, and that no stolen property had been found in her possession or home despite thorough searches. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s, named Margaret Holland, listened to both sides and then looked directly at Richard. "Mr. Monroe, your reputation precedes you. You're known for taking high-profile corporate cases, not criminal defense for indigent defendants. Why are you representing Ms. Carter?" Richard had prepared for this question. "Your Honor, I believe Ms. Carter is innocent, and I believe she's being scapegoated for a crime she didn't commit. I've reviewed the evidence, and I've interviewed my client extensively. Nothing about this case makes sense if you actually believe Lauren Carter stole that necklace. She's worked as a housekeeper for 5 years with access to countless valuable items in multiple homes. She's never been accused of theft before, never had so much as a complaint. She has a 4-year-old daughter who depends entirely on her. The prosecution wants the court to believe that this woman, with everything to lose and a spotless record, suddenly decided to steal a necklace from a client's bedroom in broad daylight, despite knowing there were security cameras in the house. That's not rational behavior. That's a desperate prosecutor building a case on opportunity and circumstance because they don't have actual evidence of guilt. Judge Holland considered this for a long moment. "Bail is set at $50,000, she finally said. "Ms. Carter is to surrender her passport if she has one. She's not to leave the state, and she's to report weekly to a probation officer until trial. Next case." Richard felt triumph surge through him. 50,000 was manageable. He could post bail, get Lauren out today, reunite her with Sophie. As he left the courthouse, he was already making calls, arranging the bail payment, contacting Mrs. Chen to let her know Lauren would be home by evening. When he finally arrived at the detention center with the bail paperwork, Lauren looked at him with such profound gratitude that he felt uncomfortable. "Mr. Monroe, I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "And I don't know how I'll ever repay you for the bail money. I can set up a payment plan, work extra jobs, whatever it takes." Richard shook his head. "Don't worry about the money right now. We'll figure that out after we win your case. Right now, I just want to get you home to your daughter. She misses you, Lauren. She's been wearing your yellow gloves and asking about you constantly. Mrs. Chen says she cries herself to sleep every night." Lauren's eyes filled with tears. "Those gloves," she said with a watery laugh. "I keep them because they were expensive and they last forever, but they're way too big for her. She's always putting them on and pretending to clean like I do. She says they make her feel close to me when I'm at work." She wiped her eyes. "I can't believe she walked all those blocks by herself to find you. She must have been so scared, but she did it anyway. That's my Sophie, braver than I ever was." Richard thought about Sophie's small hand in his, about her absolute certainty that he would help. "She's an incredible kid," he said, "and she got her bravery from you. You're raising her right, Lauren. Even in the middle of all this nightmare, that much is obvious." An hour later, after processing paperwork that seemed to take forever, Lauren walked out of the detention center a free woman, at least temporarily. Richard drove her back to Mrs. Chen's apartment, listening as she talked nervously about seeing Sophie again, about explaining where she'd been, about trying to make everything okay for a 4-year-old who shouldn't have had to go through any of this. When they arrived at the building, Sophie was playing outside with some other neighborhood kids, supervised by Mrs. Chen. The moment she saw her mother getting out of Richard's car, she let out a shriek of pure joy that probably woke up half the neighborhood. "Mama!" Sophie screamed, running full speed toward Lauren with her yellow gloves flapping comically on her hands. Lauren dropped to her knees and caught her daughter in a hug so tight, Richard was momentarily concerned about Sophie's ability to breathe. Both of them were crying and laughing at the same time, saying, "I love you" and "I missed you," over and over in a jumbled mess of emotion that made Richard's chest ache with the beauty and pain of it. This was what he'd fought for, this reunion, this joy, the sight of a mother and daughter who belonged together finally getting to hold each other again. After several minutes of crying and hugging, Sophie finally pulled back enough to look at her mother's face. "Mama, Mr. Richard brought you home. I told you he would. I told you he was a good lawyer." She turned to look at Richard with a smile so bright it could have lit up the whole city. "Thank you, Mr. Richard. Thank you for bringing my mama back." Richard felt something crack completely open in his chest, that last wall of ice he'd been hiding behind for 7 years finally shattering. "You're welcome, Sophie," he managed to say, his voice rougher than usual. "You hired the right person for the job." Lauren stood up, still holding Sophie's hand, and looked at Richard with eyes full of gratitude and something else he couldn't quite name. "Mr. Monroe, Richard, I don't have words big enough to thank you. You've given me my daughter back. You've given Sophie her mother. Whatever happens with the trial, whatever comes next, I'll never forget what you've done for us." Richard nodded, suddenly feeling awkward and out of place in the middle of this family moment. "We're not done yet," he said. "This is just the first step. We still have to prove your innocence and make sure this doesn't follow you for the rest of your life. But for tonight, just be with your daughter. Be home. I'll call you tomorrow and we'll talk about next steps." As he turned to leave, Sophie called out to him, "Mr. Richard, wait." She ran over, still wearing those yellow gloves, and held something out to him. It was a drawing, clearly done by a child, showing 3 stick figures. One tall figure in what appeared to be a suit, one medium figure with long hair, and one tiny figure with obvious yellow rectangles on her hands. Above them, in wobbly letters, Sophie had written, "My family," with a backwards F. "I made this for you," Sophie said seriously, "because you're part of our family now. You saved Mama, and that makes you special. Will you keep it?" Richard took the drawing, looking at the 3 stick figures holding hands, and felt his vision blur slightly. "I'll keep it forever," he promised, and meant it. He looked up at Lauren, who was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "She's talked about you non-stop since you first came to see me," Lauren said softly. "She's decided you're some kind of hero. I hope that's okay." Richard looked at this woman who'd been through hell and was still standing, still fighting, still raising an incredible daughter despite everything the world had thrown at her. He looked at Sophie, brave and bright and full of love, despite only being 4 years old. And he realized that somewhere along the way, they'd stopped being just a case to him. They'd become something more, something important, something he wanted to protect, not just as a lawyer, but as a person. "It's more than okay," he said quietly. "You two have given me something I didn't even know I was missing. So thank you, both of you, for trusting me, for letting me help, for reminding me why I became a lawyer in the first place." As he drove back to his penthouse that night, Richard looked at Sophie's drawing on the passenger seat and felt something shift fundamentally inside him. For 7 years, he'd been the Ice King, cold and untouchable and alone. But a little girl with yellow gloves had melted that ice with nothing but trust and love and a bruised banana. He didn't know where this was all going, what would happen after the trial, whether he'd remain in Lauren and Sophie's life or drift back to his corporate world once his job was done. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He wasn't the same man who'd been standing outside his office building a few days ago. That man had been half alive, going through motions without really feeling anything. This man, the one driving home with a child's drawing on his passenger seat, felt fully alive for the first time in years. And it was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Richard Monroe, the Ice King, had finally thawed, and it had all started with a pair of yellow gloves. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of investigation, legal maneuvering, and unexpected domesticity. Richard found himself falling into a routine that would have shocked anyone who knew him professionally. He'd spend his days working the case, following leads Diana uncovered, building his defense strategy, and then his evenings would somehow end up at Lauren's apartment. the small two-bedroom place she and Sophie had moved back into after being released on bail. He told himself he was just checking in on his client, making sure she was following bail conditions, keeping her updated on case developments. But the truth was more complicated than that. The truth was that he looked forward to those evening visits more than he'd looked forward to anything in years. He'd show up with takeout because Lauren was too proud to accept money but couldn't refuse a meal he'd already bought, and Sophie would come running to the door in her yellow gloves, and they'd sit around Lauren's tiny kitchen table eating Thai food or pizza or whatever he'd picked up. And for a few hours, Richard would feel like he was part of something real, something warm, something that mattered in ways his corporate victories never had. "Tell me again about the bad lady," Sophie said one evening, her mouth full of lo mein noodles. Her yellow gloves somehow managing to grip chopsticks despite being 3 sizes too large. "Tell me how you're going to prove Mama didn't steal her ugly necklace." Richard smiled at her characterization of Mrs. Ashford as the bad lady, though it wasn't inaccurate. "Well, we have something called evidence," he explained, in the patient voice he'd developed for talking to Sophie. "Evidence is like clues that help us figure out what really happened. And the clues we've found suggest that Mrs. Ashford might have lied about your mama stealing the necklace. We think she still has the necklace, or she sold it herself, and she's trying to blame your mama so she can get money from her insurance company." Sophie's eyes went wide. "That's mean. Why would she do that? Doesn't she have lots of money already?" Lauren laughed softly from where she was serving rice. "Having money and needing money are 2 different things, sweetheart. Some people always want more, even if they already have plenty. It's called greed." Richard watched Lauren move around her small kitchen with efficient grace and felt that now familiar tightness in his chest. She was beautiful, he'd realized, though not in the obvious way Patricia Ashford was beautiful with her designer clothes and professional styling. Lauren's beauty was quieter, deeper, the kind that came from strength and kindness and absolute devotion to her daughter. She wore old jeans and a faded t-shirt, her hair in a simple ponytail, no makeup, and Richard thought she was the most attractive woman he'd seen in years. "Mr. Richard, are you listening?" Sophie's voice broke through his thoughts. He realized he'd been staring at Lauren, and when he looked back at Sophie, she was grinning at him with the knowing look of a child who'd noticed something the adults thought was secret. "Sorry, what did you say?" Richard asked, feeling his face heat up slightly. "I asked if you're going to send the bad lady to jail when you prove she lied," Sophie repeated. "Because if she lied and tried to hurt Mama, she should get in trouble. That's fair." Richard considered how to explain the complexities of the legal system to a 4-year-old. "If we prove Mrs. Ashford lied, she'll definitely get in trouble. The police might investigate her for insurance fraud, which is a crime. And your Mama will be completely cleared. That's the most important part. Making sure everyone knows your Mama is innocent." Sophie nodded seriously, apparently satisfied with this answer. "And then will you marry Mama and be my daddy?" The question came out so casually, so matter-of-factly, that it took Richard a moment to process what she'd said. When he did, he nearly choked on his water. Lauren, who'd been taking a sip of tea, actually did choke, coughing and sputtering, while Richard instinctively got up to pat her back. "Sophie," Lauren managed once she could breathe again, her face bright red. "You can't just ask people that. We're not, Mr. Monroe is our lawyer, not—" She trailed off, seemingly unable to complete the thought while Richard stood next to her, his hand still on her back, feeling the warmth of her through her thin t-shirt. Sophie looked between them with that unnervingly perceptive gaze children sometimes have. "But you like each other," she said, as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. "Mr. Richard smiles at you like you're pretty, and you smile at him like he makes you happy. And Mr. Richard comes to see us every day, even though lawyers are very busy. And you always make sure you look nice before he comes, even though you say you're not making an effort. I'm only 4 3/4, but I'm not silly. I know when grown-ups like each other." Richard felt like he'd been caught doing something wrong, though he wasn't sure what. He carefully removed his hand from Lauren's back and returned to his seat, not quite meeting her eyes. "Sophie, sweetheart, Mr. Monroe has been very kind to us. But that's because he's our lawyer, and he's helping us with a difficult situation. That doesn't mean it's not the same as—" Lauren fumbled for words, clearly as flustered as Richard felt. I just want a daddy, Sophie said quietly, and there was something in her voice that made both adults stop their awkward deflections and really look at her. All my friends at the community center have daddies. Some of them have two mummies or two daddies, and that's okay too, but they all have more than one person who loves them. And Mama works so hard, and I know she gets tired and lonely sometimes, even though she tries to hide it. And Mr. Richard looks sad too, like he's missing something important. So I thought maybe if you got married, nobody would have to be sad or lonely anymore. We could all be happy together. The simple logic of it, the pure-hearted desire of a child who wanted the people she loved to be happy, made Richard's throat tighten with emotion. He looked at Lauren and saw tears gathering in her eyes, though she was trying to blink them away. "Baby," Lauren said gently, reaching across the table to take Sophie's small hand, the one not currently encased in a yellow glove. "I love you more than anything in the world. And you're right that sometimes I get tired and lonely. But my job as your mama is to take care of you and make sure you're happy and safe. I don't need anything else. You're enough for me. You're more than enough." She finally glanced at Richard, and there was something vulnerable in her eyes that made his heart race. "And Mr. Monroe has been incredibly kind to us, kinder than I ever expected or deserved. But he has his own life, his own world that's very different from ours. When this case is over, he'll go back to that world, and we'll go back to ours, and that's okay. We'll always be grateful to him, but we can't expect anything more than what he's already given us." Richard felt something twist in his chest at her words, at the resigned acceptance in her voice, as if it was inevitable that he would leave once his job was done. Was that really what she thought? That he was just doing his duty, fulfilling an obligation, counting down the days until he could return to his empty penthouse and his corporate cases? Or was she protecting herself, keeping her expectations low so she wouldn't be disappointed when he inevitably let her down? "What if I don't want to go back to my world?" Richard heard himself say, the words coming out before his brain had fully processed the thought. Both Lauren and Sophie stared at him. "What if I've realized that my world is cold and empty and meaningless? What if I've spent the past 2 weeks feeling more alive than I have in 7 years? What if a 4-year-old in yellow gloves showed me that I've been hiding from life because I was scared of getting hurt again? And what if I'm tired of hiding?" Lauren's eyes had gone wide, her lips parted in surprise. "Richard," she whispered, and it was the first time she'd called him by his first name instead of Mr. Monroe. "What are you saying?" Richard stood up, suddenly needing to move, to pace, to channel the nervous energy coursing through him. "I'm saying that Sophie isn't wrong. I do like you, Lauren. More than like you. I've been coming here every evening, not because I need to check on my client, but because being here, with you and Sophie, is the best part of my day. I'm saying that I wake up in the morning, and the first thing I think about is whether I'll have a good enough excuse to stop by that evening. I'm saying that I've started keeping Thai takeout menus in my car, and I bought a set of children's books yesterday because I thought Sophie might like them. I'm saying that I'm 45 years old and I feel like a teenager with a crush, and it's terrifying and wonderful, and I don't know what to do about it." He stopped pacing and looked directly at Lauren, his heart pounding. "I lost my wife and daughter 7 years ago. Car accident. I was supposed to pick them up from her doctor's appointment. She was 8 months pregnant, but I got held up at work. They took a cab instead. A drunk driver ran a red light and hit them head on. Isabella died instantly. They tried to save the baby, but she was too premature, too damaged from the impact. I held her for 17 minutes before she died. We'd already named her Anna. She had Isabella's dark hair." His voice cracked slightly, but he pushed through. "After that, I shut down. I built walls. I became the Ice King because ice doesn't feel pain. I took only corporate cases, made millions, bought expensive things, and felt absolutely nothing. For 7 years, I felt nothing. And then a little girl with yellow gloves and a bruised banana looked at me with complete trust, and something in me broke open. You two have made me feel again, and yes, it's scary, but it's also the most real thing that's happened to me since I lost my family." Lauren had tears streaming down her face. "Richard, I'm so sorry about your wife and daughter. I can't imagine how much pain you've carried. But you have to understand, we're not. I'm a housekeeper with a 4-year-old and a criminal charge hanging over my head. You're this brilliant attorney who lives in a world I can't even imagine. Even if you think you want this now, what happens in a month, a year, when the novelty wears off? When you remember that you're supposed to be with someone sophisticated and successful, not someone who cleans toilets for a living? Richard moved to her side of the table, kneeling beside her chair so they were at eye level. Lauren, I don't care what you do for work. I care that you're raising an incredible daughter. I care that you're brave and strong and kind. I care that when you smile at me, I feel like the sun came out. I care that you make me want to be better than I've been. I'm not asking you to marry me tonight. I'm not asking you to make any decisions while your case is still pending and your life is in chaos. I'm just asking if maybe, when this is all over and you're cleared and life settles down, I could take you to dinner. A real date. Just the two of us. And we could see if this thing between us is real, or if I'm just having some kind of midlife crisis brought on by yellow gloves and takeout noodles. Lauren laughed through her tears. Yellow gloves and takeout noodles. That's possibly the worst basis for a relationship I've ever heard. She reached up and touched his face gently, her palm warm against his cheek. But yes, when this is over, when I'm not your client anymore, yes, you can take me to dinner. I'd like that. I'd like that a lot. Sophie, who'd been watching this exchange with wide eyes, suddenly let out a whoop of joy. Does this mean Mr. Richard is going to be my daddy? She shouted, bouncing in her seat. Both adults laughed, the tension breaking. It means we're going to take things slow and see what happens, Lauren said firmly. It means Mr. Richard and Mama like each other and want to spend more time together. But you don't rush into families, sweetheart. Families take time to build, and that's okay. Sophie considered this. But you're not saying no, she pressed. I'm saying maybe, Lauren replied, and sometimes maybe is the best answer you can get. Sophie seemed satisfied with this. Okay, but can Mr. Richard come to my birthday party next week, because I'm turning 5 and that's a really big deal, and I want him to be there. Richard looked at Lauren, who nodded. You're invited, she said softly. If you want to come, it'll be nothing fancy, just some kids from the community center and a cake from the grocery store. Very different from the world you're used to. Richard thought about the charity galas and corporate dinners he usually attended. Stiff affairs where everyone was networking and no one was really enjoying themselves. It sounds perfect, he said honestly. I'd be honored to come to your birthday party, Sophie. As he drove home that night, Richard couldn't stop smiling. He'd admitted feelings he'd barely acknowledged to himself, had shared his past with Lauren, had essentially declared his intentions and been accepted, tentatively but genuinely. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. But the case wasn't over yet. He still had to prove Lauren's innocence, still had to make sure she was free and clear before they could really explore what was growing between them. And that meant he needed Diana to find the smoking gun that would blow Patricia Ashford's story apart. As if summoned by his thoughts, his phone rang. Diana's name flashed on the screen. Please tell me you have good news, Richard said by way of greeting. Better than good, Diana replied, and he could hear the satisfaction in her voice. I found it. I found the necklace. And you're never going to believe where it was. Richard pulled his car over, his full attention now on the call. Tell me everything. Diana's voice was gleeful as she explained. So I've been monitoring Mrs. Ashford's social media religiously, right? And this morning she posted a photo from a charity luncheon she attended. Nothing unusual, just her and her society friends doing their society thing. But in the background of the photo, barely visible but definitely there if you zoom in, is another woman wearing the necklace. The supposedly stolen $75,000 diamond necklace that Mrs. Ashford claimed was taken from her bedroom. Richard felt adrenaline surge through him. Are you sure it's the same necklace? Diana laughed. I'm sure. It has a distinctive asymmetrical design, 3 tiers of diamonds with a sapphire accent on the left side. There's no mistaking it. And here's where it gets better. I ran facial recognition on the woman wearing it. Her name is Melissa Harrington, and she's Mrs. Ashford's college roommate and best friend. They're constantly posting photos together, always at the same events. I dug deeper and found out that Melissa runs an upscale consignment boutique in Buckhead that sells estate jewelry. You want to bet me that Mrs. Ashford sold her friend the necklace before reporting it stolen, and her friend is now wearing it around town thinking nobody would notice? Richard's mind was already racing through the implications. If we can prove Mrs. Ashford sold the necklace before reporting it stolen, we have her dead to rights on insurance fraud. That's a felony. The charges against Lauren get dropped immediately. Diana, you're brilliant. Can you get me a subpoena for Melissa Harrington's business records? I want to see every transaction from the past 3 months. Already on it, Diana replied. I figured you'd want to move fast on this. I'll have the paperwork ready by morning. We can probably get a judge to sign off by afternoon, and then we go scorched earth on Mrs. Ashford and her accomplice. This is going to be very satisfying, boss. Very satisfying indeed. Richard thanked Diana and hung up, then immediately called Lauren. She answered on the second ring, sounding worried. Richard, is everything okay? It's late. Everything's better than okay, Richard said, unable to keep the excitement out of his voice. We've got her, Lauren. We've got proof that Mrs. Ashford lied about the theft. The case against you is going to fall apart. You're going to be completely exonerated. He heard Lauren's sharp intake of breath, then the sound of muffled crying. Are you serious? You're not just saying that to make me feel better. This is real. Richard felt his throat tighten at the hope and disbelief in her voice. It's real. I'll have more details tomorrow once we get the subpoenas processed. But Lauren, you're going to be free. Completely free. No charges, no criminal record, nothing. This nightmare is almost over. There was a long pause, and then Lauren whispered, Thank you. Thank you for believing me when nobody else did. Thank you for fighting for me. Thank you for being the person Sophie knew you were from the moment she saw you. I can't even find the words for how grateful I am. Richard smiled. You can thank me by wearing something nice to dinner once this is all over. I'm taking you somewhere expensive, and you're going to let me spoil you a little. Deal? He heard her laugh through her tears. Deal. Now go get some sleep. Tomorrow you're going to destroy the bad lady, as Sophie would say, and I want you well rested for it. The next 3 days moved at lightning speed. The subpoena was granted, Melissa Harrington's business records were seized, and sure enough, there was a transaction dated 2 days before the alleged theft, showing that Patricia Ashford had sold a diamond necklace, matching the exact description of the stolen one to the consignment boutique for $45,000. When confronted with this evidence, Melissa Harrington crumbled immediately and admitted that Patricia had asked her to hold on to the necklace and not process the sale officially until after the insurance claim went through. Patricia had promised to split the insurance money with Melissa in exchange for her cooperation. Richard presented all of this to the district attorney, along with the social media photo showing Melissa wearing the necklace. Diana's financial investigation showing Patricia's desperate monetary situation, and a timeline proving Patricia had sold the necklace before she ever reported it stolen. The DA took one look at the evidence and dropped all charges against Lauren Carter within an hour. By the end of the week, it was Patricia Ashford and Melissa Harrington who were being charged with insurance fraud and filing a false police report. The media had a field day with it. Wealthy socialite frames her housekeeper for theft while committing insurance fraud became the scandal of the season in Atlanta's social circles. Richard gave several interviews, making sure to emphasize Lauren's innocence, her sterling record, and the injustice of how she'd been treated. He wanted to make sure that when potential employers Googled Lauren's name, they found stories of her vindication, not the initial arrest. On the day the charges were officially dropped, Richard took Lauren and Sophie to the courthouse to get the paperwork finalized. Sophie insisted on wearing her yellow gloves for the occasion, saying they were lucky and had made everything work out. As they walked out of the courthouse into the bright autumn sunshine, Lauren stopped on the steps and just breathed, her face tilted up to the sky, tears streaming down her cheeks. It's really over, she whispered. I'm really free. Richard stood beside her, his hand finding hers naturally. You're free, he confirmed, and now we can move forward, all of us. Sophie, standing between them, took Richard's other hand and squeezed it with her yellow-gloved grip. Now you can be my daddy for real, right? Now that you're not Mama's lawyer anymore. Richard looked at Lauren, who was watching him with soft eyes. I think we're supposed to go on a date first, he said gently. But yes, Sophie, I'd very much like to be part of your family if your Mama will have me. Not rushing, not pushing, just seeing where this goes. Lauren smiled, and it was like the sun breaking through clouds. I think I'd like that too. Dinner, dates, seeing where it goes. I'm ready when you are. Richard felt something settle in his chest, something warm and right and complete. 7 years ago, he'd lost everything. He'd become the Ice King, cold and untouchable, convinced he'd never feel anything again. But a little girl with yellow gloves had melted that ice, and her mother had shown him that love didn't have to mean loss, that opening his heart again didn't make him weak, but made him human. Sophie, Richard said seriously, kneeling down to her level, I want to thank you for something. Sophie cocked her head curiously. For what? For being brave enough to walk 4 blocks by yourself to find me. For trusting me when you had no reason to. For offering me your banana even though it was all you had. You saved your mama, but you also saved me. You reminded me what it means to be a good person, to fight for what's right, to let people in even when it's scary. Those yellow gloves of yours aren't just lucky, they're magic. They gave you the strength to save your family, and in doing that, you gave me a family too. Sophie threw her arms around his neck. I love you, Mr. Richard, she said simply, as only a child could, with absolute honesty and no fear of rejection. Richard hugged her back, his eyes stinging with tears he didn't bother to hide. I love you too, Sophie, and I love your mama. And if you'll have me, I'd like to stick around for a very long time. Maybe forever. Sophie pulled back and looked at him with those knowing eyes. Does that mean you're going to marry Mama eventually? Richard laughed and glanced at Lauren, who was blushing and smiling. Eventually, he admitted, if she'll have me. But first, we date. Then maybe in a year or two, if everything goes well, I'll ask her properly, with a ring and everything. But that's a surprise for later, so you can't tell her I said that. Sophie's eyes went wide. I can keep a secret, she whispered loudly, in that way children do when they're trying to whisper but actually speaking at normal volume. I'll be very quiet about the ring and the wedding and everything. Lauren laughed. I can hear you, sweetheart. Mr. Richard's secret isn't very secret anymore. Richard stood and offered his arm to Lauren. Well, in that case, fair warning. I'm absolutely going to marry you someday, Lauren Carter. I'm going to spoil your daughter rotten, and I'm going to make sure you never have to worry about money or work or anything ever again. And I'm going to love you both every single day for the rest of my life. So if that's not what you want, you'd better say so now. Lauren took his arm, her smile bright and true. That sounds perfect, she said softly. Absolutely perfect. As they walked down the courthouse steps together, a small family in the making, Richard thought about the strange journey that had led him here. The tragedy that had broken him. The years of emotional isolation, the little girl with yellow gloves who'd cracked through his walls with nothing but faith and a bruised banana. Sometimes the best things in life came from the worst moments. Sometimes loss led to love. Sometimes a chance encounter outside an office building could change everything. Richard Monroe, formerly known as the Ice King, had finally thawed completely, and he'd never been warmer or happier in his entire life. 6 months later, Richard stood in Lauren's small apartment, which he'd been slowly helping her move out of, into a proper house he'd bought in a good neighborhood with excellent schools, watching Sophie dance around in a new yellow dress that matched her beloved gloves. It was her 5th birthday party, and the living room was full of children from the community center, laughing and playing and eating cake. Lauren came up beside him, slipping her hand into his naturally, as if they'd been doing this forever instead of just half a year. Happy? She asked softly. Richard looked around at the chaos, the joy, the mess of children and wrapping paper and spilled juice that would have horrified his old self. Happier than I ever thought possible, he admitted. This is real. This is life. This is everything I was missing. Sophie ran over, her yellow gloves now joined by matching yellow shoes and hair ribbons. Mr. Richard, are you having fun at my party? Richard scooped her up, making her squeal with delight. Best party I've ever been to, he said honestly. And hey, I have a present for you, but it's not the kind you unwrap. It's a question. Sophie's eyes went wide. What kind of question? Richard set her down and pulled out a small jewelry box. Inside was a delicate gold bracelet with a tiny charm in the shape of yellow gloves. Sophie Carter, would you do me the honor of being my daughter? Not legally, not yet, because that takes time and paperwork. But in our hearts, in our family. I'd like to be your dad, for real and forever. What do you say? Sophie looked at the bracelet, then at her mother, then at Richard. Really, she whispered, really, really. You want to be my daddy forever? Richard felt tears sting his eyes. Really, really, more than anything. Sophie launched herself at him with such force he nearly fell over. Yes, 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 yes. I want you to be my daddy. I've wanted it since the very first day when I gave you my banana. She pulled back and looked at him seriously. But you have to promise to always love Mama and never make her sad. Richard smiled and looked at Lauren, who was openly crying now. I promise I'll love your mama forever and always do my best to make her happy. And I promise I'll love you forever too and be the best dad I can be, even though I'm learning as I go. Deal. Sophie stuck out her hand solemnly. Deal. They shook on it, and then Richard fastened the bracelet around her tiny wrist. She held it up to the light, watching it sparkle next to her yellow gloves. It's perfect, she breathed. I'm never taking it off. Ever. As Sophie ran back to her friends to show off her new bracelet, Lauren moved into Richard's arms. You didn't have to do that, she whispered. You've already done so much for us. Richard held her close, breathing in the scent of her hair, marveling at how perfectly she fit against him. I did have to do that. She saved me, Lauren. You both did. I was half dead inside, just going through motions, and you brought me back to life. I want to make it official, all of it. You, me, Sophie. A real family. Lauren pulled back to look at him. Are you sure? Because once you commit to this, to us, I'm not letting you go. You'll be stuck with school plays and skinned knees and parent-teacher conferences and all the messy, complicated, wonderful chaos of raising a child. Your Ice King days are over, Richard Monroe. Are you ready for that? Richard thought about his empty penthouse, his corporate victories that meant nothing, his years of careful emotional distance. Then he looked at Sophie, laughing with her friends, at Lauren's beautiful face full of love and hope, at the life they were building together. The Ice King is dead, he said firmly. Long live the dad who gets to wear matching yellow gloves at birthday parties. Lauren laughed and kissed him, and in that moment, surrounded by children and cake and chaos and love, Richard knew he'd finally found what he'd been missing. Not just a family to replace the one he'd lost, but a new beginning, a second chance, a future full of yellow gloves and bruised bananas and all the messy beauty of real life. 1 year later, Richard stood at the altar of a small church, his hands sweating slightly despite years of courtroom composure. His best man, a partner from his firm who still couldn't quite believe the Ice King was getting married, leaned over and whispered, "You okay, man? You look nervous." Richard smiled, terrified. Best terrified I've ever been. The music started, and Sophie came down the aisle first as Flower Girl, wearing a pale yellow dress and, of course, her yellow gloves. She took her role very seriously, carefully dropping petals and waving at guests she recognized. When she reached the altar, she stage whispered loud enough for everyone to hear, "Don't worry, Mr. Richard. Mama looks really pretty. You're going to love it." Then the doors opened again, and Lauren appeared, and Richard forgot how to breathe. She wore a simple white dress, nothing extravagant, but she was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. As she walked toward him, he thought about the journey that had brought them here, the bankruptcy and loss that had forged him into the Ice King, the little girl with yellow gloves who'd melted that ice, the brave single mother who'd shown him that love was worth the risk, the family they'd built together from broken pieces and banana peels and absolute faith. When Lauren reached him, she took his hands and smiled up at him with eyes full of love. "Hi," she whispered. "Hi," he whispered back. "You ready for this? Forever with me and Sophie and whoever else comes along? All the chaos and mess and beautiful disaster of family life." Lauren squeezed his hands. "I've been ready since the day a 4-year-old in yellow gloves told me she'd hired you. I knew then somehow that you were going to change our lives." The ceremony was simple but perfect. When it came time for vows, Richard spoke from the heart. "Lauren, you and Sophie saved my life. I was drowning in grief and isolation, and I didn't even know it until a tiny hand offered me a banana and asked for help. You've taught me that strength isn't about emotional walls. It's about being brave enough to feel everything. You've shown me that family isn't just blood. It's choice and commitment and showing up every single day. I promise to show up for you and Sophie every single day for the rest of my life. I promise to be the man you both deserve, to be a good husband and a good father, to love you through the chaos and the calm, through the yellow gloves and the skinned knees and every single messy, beautiful moment ahead of us." Lauren was crying, and when it was her turn to speak, her voice shook with emotion. "Richard, 7 years ago you lost everything, and so did I in my own way. I was drowning in poverty and fear and the weight of raising Sophie alone. But we found each other, and together we built something new. You've given me security and love and partnership. You've given Sophie a father who adores her. You've shown us both that good men exist, that love is real, that families can be built from the strangest beginnings. I promise to love you through your nightmares and your joys, to be your partner in all things, to build a life with you that honors both the past we've survived and the future we're creating. You're stuck with us now, Ice King, forever." They exchanged rings, simple gold bands that Richard had inscribed with yellow gloves and bruised bananas because some inside jokes were too perfect not to immortalize. When the officiant said, "You may kiss the bride," Richard did so with all the love and gratitude and joy he'd been holding back. Sophie cheered so loudly she nearly drowned out the applause from the guests, and when Richard and Lauren turned to face the crowd as husband and wife, Sophie squeezed between them and took both their hands. The photographer captured it perfectly, 3 people who'd found each other against all odds. A family forged from loss and faith and yellow gloves, smiling at a future that promised to be complicated and messy and absolutely perfect. As they walked back down the aisle together, Richard caught sight of a photo in the church lobby, one he'd donated to be hung there. It was the drawing Sophie had given him that first week, the 3 stick figures holding hands with "My family" written across the top in a child's careful letters. He'd had it professionally framed, and every time he saw it, he was reminded of how far they'd all come. At the reception, during the father-daughter dance, Sophie rested her head against Richard's shoulder and said quietly, "I'm glad I found you that day, Daddy. I'm glad you took my banana." Richard felt tears sting his eyes for the 100th time that day. "Me too, sweetheart. Best banana I ever received. Changed my whole life." Sophie pulled back and looked at him seriously. "When I grow up, I'm going to help people too. Like you helped Mama. I'm going to wear yellow gloves and find people who need help, and I'm going to save them." Richard smiled, his heart so full he thought it might burst. "I think that's a wonderful plan. The world needs more people in yellow gloves." As the song ended and Richard returned Sophie to Lauren for the mother-daughter dance, he stood at the edge of the dance floor watching his family, his heart full of gratitude for the strange and beautiful path that had led him here. He'd been the Ice King, cold and untouchable and alone. Now he was Richard Monroe, husband and father, a man who kept a bruised banana in a glass case in his office as a reminder of the day his life changed. A man who'd learned that the strongest armor could be melted by the smallest hands, that the greatest cases weren't won in boardrooms, but in moments of human connection. That family wasn't something you were born into, but something you built, brick by brick, heart by heart, yellow glove by yellow glove. 5 years later, Richard stood in the kitchen of their home, making breakfast while chaos erupted around him. Sophie, now 9, was helping her 2-year-old brother Marcus get dressed for daycare, an operation that involved more giggling than actual clothing. Lauren, 6 months pregnant with their 3rd child, sat at the kitchen table reviewing her business plan for the non-profit she'd started to help wrongfully accused individuals navigate the legal system. She'd turned their trauma into purpose, and Richard had never been prouder. "Daddy, Marcus put his shirt on backwards again," Sophie called out, her voice full of big sister exasperation. "And he says he wants to wear yellow gloves to school like mine." Richard laughed. "He's 2. Everything's backwards, and if he wants to wear yellow gloves, let him. Yellow gloves are lucky. They brought us all together." He finished plating the pancakes and looked around at his chaotic, noisy, absolutely perfect life. Lauren caught his eye and smiled, that same smile that had made him fall in love with her years ago. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. Richard walked over and kissed her, then rested his hand on her pregnant belly. "I'm thinking about bananas and yellow gloves, and how sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected places. I'm thinking about how lucky I am, how loved, how completely, impossibly happy." Sophie appeared with Marcus, who was indeed wearing his shirt backwards and sporting a pair of yellow rubber gloves. "We're ready for breakfast, Daddy." Richard scooped Marcus up with one arm and pulled Sophie close with the other. "Then let's eat. Family breakfast is the best part of the day." As they sat around the table, laughing and talking and spilling syrup, Richard thought about the man he'd been 7 years ago, the Ice King who felt nothing, who'd built walls so high no one could reach him. That man was gone, melted away by love and yellow gloves and the courage of a 4-year-old who'd offered everything she had to save her mother. In his place was this man, this father and husband, messy and imperfect, and more alive than he'd ever been. And it had all started with a bruised banana and a pair of oversized yellow gloves. Sometimes that's all it took. Sometimes that was everything. Dash, dash, dash. The end. Dash, dash, dash. Sometimes the smallest gestures change everything. Sometimes a child's faith can save not just one life, but 3. Sometimes yellow gloves are more than just rubber. They're magic, courage, and hope, all wrapped up in something practical and ordinary. May you find your own yellow gloves moment, the one that melts your ice and brings you home to where you're meant to be. Thank you for reading. I love you all.